Okay, everybody turn to Nehemiah chapter 5. We've been studying the book of Nehemiah for the last few lessons. And if you don't have an outline, raise your hand and we'll get one of the gentlemen in the back to bring you one. I try to put all the scriptures for the lessons on the outline sheet so everybody can follow along. We'll always do a real quick review, and tonight will be a very rapid review of the book of Nehemiah, chapters 1 through 4. We start out the book of Nehemiah. It's 446 years before Christ. Nehemiah is the last book of history in the Old Testament before the 400 years of silence. Nehemiah is a cupbearer, a servant to the king of Persia. Persia was the great world empire at the time, stretched from Ethiopia up to Turkey, over to what's now Pakistan and India, 127 provinces. And so Nehemiah had a very responsible position because he was the cupbearer, meaning that nothing touched the king's lips until Nehemiah had a taste or a drink of it. Because the number one way that they got rid of kings back then was assassination through poison. So somebody would be paid off in the king's guards and they would slip poison because the king was heavily guarded, so there's really no way to get in and get to him. So they would kind of do it through assassination with poison. Anyway, his brother Hananiah comes back from Jerusalem. Apparently he had gone 12 years earlier with Ezra in the group that went down with Ezra to worship in the temple there. And he comes back and begs Nehemiah to try to get the king to help them to send provisions that they can rebuild the wall about Jerusalem. The temple's been rebuilt, but in the pagan minds, which is the neighbors around Judah, their idea was that if a temple was unguarded, then the god of that temple was weak. If a city was unguarded with walls, then obviously the people were weak. And so they were in distress, and so he begged Nehemiah. Nehemiah prayed, mourned, fasted for days and days. 4 months later, the king granted his request and sent everything that he needed, all the provisions, also military escort, and they went back. And so then Nehemiah surveys the walls, and then he gets the leaders to commit to the project, gets volunteers, and they start building the wall. And last time we studied chapter 4, and we learned that they were halfway up on the wall, on this wall project, and they were becoming very discouraged. And there were several reasons they were getting discouraged. Number one, they were listening to the criticism of their enemies who lived near them. They were also fatigued and tired mentally and physically from this project. And then some of them were living too close to the enemy, and so they were believing what the enemy had to sell, which was fear. The enemy was trying to scare them. So they had lost their vision, they lost their confidence, they lost their sense of security. And so then Nehemiah showed us 4 ways that we can fight discouragement in our lives. And then we ended the lesson with a verse from 2 Corinthians 2 saying that we, Christians, are to be the aroma of Christ to the saved and to the unsaved. So we talked about, we call it the skunks of discouragement, because when a person is living a life of discouragement, that's not to say that there's not going to be discouraging things in your life and my life, but if you just stay discouraged all the time, or if you stay anxious or you stay fearful, that does not give off the aroma of Christ. That's not an attractive aroma to attract people to Christ. People say, well, if you're a Christian and that's the way you feel and that's the way you act, I don't think I want to be like that. So we need to learn to overcome the discouragements and the anxieties and the fears in our life through Christ, so that we can be the aroma of Christ to the world. Tonight we're going to look at chapter 5, but first I want to do some background. Back when I started studying the book of Nehemiah a couple of months ago, most of the commentaries, maybe you've studied Nehemiah some in the past. There's been a lot of books written about Nehemiah for Bible study books, and almost overwhelmingly they talk about Nehemiah as a book about leadership, and it certainly is. But my thought when I started this course was, let's see if there's something else we can get out of this, because everybody else talks about leadership. So I was able to do that for the first 4 lessons. But when it came to chapter 5, basically we're kind of leadership and influence is kind of staring us in the face, so we're going to kind of tackle that tonight. But first of all, before you think, well, I can check out here, I can mentally check out because I don't have any position of leadership. But if you look at the word leadership, there on your lesson sheet, leadership can be defined in a single word. And that word is influence. Influence. So I want to kind of talk about that in a minute and let you see that all of us are people of influence. You don't have to have a leadership position to be a person of influence. If you have a child, even if that child is an adult child, you have some influence over that child. If you have a brother or a sister, parents, you as a person have some influence on those people. If you even have one friend, just one friend, you have some influence over that friend. If you have a coworker, you have some influence. If you have a neighbor. So basically what we're saying is the only person in this whole wide world that has zero influence is a person that lives on a deserted island by themselves. Because if you're around people, you have the ability to influence them. Let me give you some examples to show you that influence are not necessarily leaders. Let's think about some of the public influencers in the world that we live in. What about pro sports figures? They out there and they play their sport, but what do they do on the side? They sell themselves to companies to be sponsors because they want to influence how you buy things. So they may be on a car ad or a clothes ad or a vacation ad, and so they're trying to get you to think, well, if I like this athlete, and if he thinks this is cool, then I need to do that too. So I have been influenced by that sports figure. What about movie stars, music artists? They can do the same thing. They can influence us greatly even though they are not in positions of authority over us. They're still influencers. Talk show hosts, radio, TV talk show hosts, politicians, TV preachers, newscasters. And then a new one, kind of in our generation, is YouTube influencers. I have some granddaughters up in Tulsa, and they love to watch YouTube, and it's girls their own age making slime, all sorts of slime, and it makes them want to make slime just like it because they have been influenced by the girls on YouTube, and these girls have lots of followers, so they're making money off YouTube. Another example, I have a son, Joshua, up in Chicago, and he teaches private guitar lessons on Tuesday evenings in his home. And he had this 12-year-old student for some time, but he had just taken on a new student. His next-door neighbor's older man, and that older man knew that Joshua taught guitar, and so this older man told his 23-year-old grandson that Josh taught guitar, so over the phone they agreed for him to start teaching the guitar. And so one day, this is a few months back, Joshua was finishing up the lesson with the 12-year-old, and the new student, the 23-year-old, comes in the door. The 12-year-old looks at him and absolutely goes crazy. Turns out he has a YouTube channel. He's got 6 million followers, and he just makes stupid movies. But he's making an incredible income. And so this 12-year-old is influenced. So he's not in a leadership position over her. So this is my point, is that when you talk about leadership, really we're talking about influence. And every one of us has an ability to influence the people around us. Okay, now let's kind of hit this from another angle, okay? So let me give you, would you rather, look on your lesson sheet, give me 4 options, okay? So let's go to the Ray of Hope youth group and ask them these 4 questions and see which one they would choose. Would you rather live through a hurricane, flood, or earthquake, but lose your home and all your possessions? That's your first choice. Second choice, would you rather have to work 2 jobs the rest of your life to make ends meet? Or, third choice, would you rather lose your immediate family in a house fire or a car wreck? Or number 4, would you rather be famous like a TV, movie, or sports star? So if you had to choose one of those 4 to be, which one would you like to be? So if you're in the youth group, which one do you think they're going to choose? Number 4. Everybody wants number 4, right? That's what we think in our human mind is what we would like, we'd prefer. Now, so the first three answers talk about having to live through adversity. The fourth answer is about having great worldly success to the point of being an influencer of lots of people. So see, that's what those answers are about. The first three answers are about having adversity, and the fourth one is about being success in the eyes of the world and being an influencer. Okay, but here's the paradox. That's what we need to learn tonight. The paradox is adversity is a painful but very effective teacher. In most people, adversity brings out their toughness, the survivor mode, and we tend to learn much more from adversity than we learn from success. I remember I was in New York City a year or so before 9/11, and I think that was the first time I'd ever been there. And I remember thinking, man, these people are really cold. I'd heard about Yankees all my life, and I thought, they're just not friendly. They won't look you in the eye. They don't say hi in the elevator. It wasn't like down here in the South where people, you'll wave to your strangers and wave to people on the road. Anyway, and then I remember going back to New York City about a year after 9/11. I had a meeting there, and it was like night and day. After the people of New York City had gone through that horrible adversity of 9/11, it was almost like the South. It was like people said hello, they cherished the relationship of each other that they hadn't previously because they had learned through adversity. I've got a quote there from Thomas Carlyle. He's a Scottish historian and author. He says, "Adversity is hard on a man, but for one man who can stand prosperity, there are 100 that will stand adversity." So what we're saying is adversity is a hard teacher, but when we go through adversity, we become better people because most of us kind of rise to the occasion and become survivors. So it builds our character, it makes us stronger, and the fires of adversity are actually good for us. But what Mr. Carlyle is saying is, but there's a test that's harder than adversity, that more people fail, and that's the test of success. He's saying that more people fail the test of success than fail the test of adversity. So he's saying if you're put in a position of influence, you're put in a position of promotion, of leadership, of success, more people fail that because it goes to their head than people fail the test of adversity. I mean, how many movie stars or music stars or sports stars do you know that have made absolute fools of themselves in public? How many lottery winners, we would think they have worldly success because they won the lottery. How many of those are broke in 5 years? Almost 100%. So you see, success didn't really help them. They didn't come through that, and it helped build their character. How many politicians have failed the test of influence? How many TV evangelists have failed the influencer test? So that's what Mr. Carlyle is saying, that the test of leadership, the test of being an influencer, the test of getting a promotion, the test of success ruins many more people than going through adversity. And so the paradox is, when we pray, what do we pray for? We pray to God for success. We pray to God to not let us go through adversity. And yet the old saying is, be careful what you pray for, because we're praying for something that many more of us are going to fail than if we just went through some adversity, because God uses adversity to help build us. So what I'm trying to get into before we get into the lesson is just saying that if we have any area of influence in our life at all, and like I said, unless you live on an island by yourself, you have some influence on somebody, and probably several people, probably a lot of people. But it's important to study that, because an influencer, that means you're somewhat of a leader, and the test of leadership is much harder than the test of adversity, because leadership ruins many more people than adversity ever ruined. To give you some resources, I've read a lot of books on leadership in the past, and now what I do, I listen to more podcasts while I'm driving or working out in the yard. And a couple of these are really, really good. I put them on your lesson sheet there. These are both Christian-based leadership podcasts. John Maxwell started out as a pastor. He's now kind of America's leadership guru. And then Craig Groeschel, you may have heard his name. He is the pastor of the Life Church in Edmond that is now worldwide. But both of them have podcasts, and every week they come out with a new 20-minute podcast on a different area of how to be an influencer in other people's lives in a Christian way. So I recommend those to you if you want to learn more about how to be a better influencer to other people. Okay, so now we're going to look at chapter 5 and see how Nehemiah handles influence. There on your lesson sheet, we'll start with verse 14. Moreover, so this is Nehemiah speaking here, from the time I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year to the 32nd year of Artaxerxes the king, 12 years. And so, it's just, he states this as a matter of fact. I was appointed governor. He didn't say I'm hot stuff, I'm a big cheese. Just, I was governor, and I was there for 12 years. Y'all that are old enough may remember Muhammad Ali. Remember Muhammad Ali, the boxer, Muhammad Ali, the heavyweight boxer? In the fight, what was considered the fight of the century, the heavyweight fight of the century, March 8th, 1971, Muhammad Ali, who for years had proclaimed, you remember what he said? I am the greatest, I am the greatest, I am the greatest. So in the fight of the century, he steps into the ring with Joe Frazier, and he finds out he's not the greatest. And so self-promotion can often bring you humility. As soon as you put yourself up on a pedestal, somebody's going to knock you down. So here Nehemiah is not promoting himself. You may have heard of Asaph. He wrote 12 Psalms. This is a couple of verses from Psalm 75, one of the 12 Psalms of Asaph. And he talks about where we get promotion from. This I know, the favor that brings promotion and power doesn't come from anywhere on earth. For no one exalts a person but God, the true judge of all. He alone determines where favor rests. He anoints one for greatness and brings another down to his knees. And so, he's saying, if God has put you in some position of influence, it's not the time to toot your horn. It's not the time to be proud. It's not the time to be puffed up. It's not the time for you to feel like you can lord it over somebody else. But rather, the hand of God has moved you into a position where you can be a good influence for God, influence for Christ on the people around you. And so it's not a time to feel proud about that. It's a time to be humble and realize that you have a responsibility. It's simply a responsibility. It's not a position of glory. It's a position of responsibility. My father was a great example to me about that. He was a great engineer. He was the chief engineer for one of America's big defense corporations. And as Vietnam War was closing down, they didn't have any more planes and missiles to build for the Army, so they decided to get him to the transportation business. And that was about the time DFW, the airport, was being built. And so DFW Airport wanted an automatic people mover. This had never been done in the history of the world, where there was trains with no drivers. And so his corporation decided that they would bid on that because they wanted to move from defense into transportation. And it's interesting because he told me that as they were talking to the planners of DFW Airport, they said, well, where do you get the idea for this? Because nobody's ever done this. They said, well, there's actually a ride at Disneyland that's kind of like this, and we just think it could be done on a big scale. Anyway, so his company gets the bid for it, and they spend several years making this thing, and so it's still in operation today. And I knew he worked long and hard. I was already in college at that time, but it was a successful project. Well, 20 years later, he's already retired. He and my stepmom had moved to Tyler, and this is before cell phones. So one weekday evening, I called to Tyler to see how they're doing, and my stepmom says, "Well," I said, "Where's Dad?" She said, "Well, he's back at the airport." And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, he hadn't told you, for several months now. He's spending Monday through Friday at the airport. American Airlines has called him back to design their own people mover for their 2 terminals. And I said, well, that's great. He never told me that. I said, he never tells me anything about, good things like that. He just does them. And she says, well, I bet you never heard about what happened 20 years ago. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, after he and his team designed that automated people mover, the first one in the world, he said he was nominated by the Society of Automotive Engineers as the Transportation Engineer of the Year in the world. I said then he got a phone call from Lee Iacocca, because Lee Iacocca had been through DFW Airport, and this was the same time of the Arab oil embargo, and Lee Iacocca at the time was the president of Ford. And he was really upset that we couldn't get enough gasoline. Those of you who are old enough remember we'd had stand in line for gasoline. You could buy your license plate, at least in Texas, depending on where you had an even or an odd license plate number, you could get 5 gallons of gas every other day. And that went on for several months. And so Lee Iacocca called my dad, and he said, we need to do something to get our nation out of the dependence of Arab oil. I think we need to start working on electric cars. And I've had a headhunter team put together 5 people from the nation, and you're top of the list. And I want you to come up here and start the process of developing an electric car for Chrysler, because we need to get rid of this Arab oil. Anyway, my stepmom said, my dad told him, well, thank you very much, but I'm really happy where I am. I got a good salary. I like my family, like my church. My family's around here, my home's here. I don't really want to move to Detroit, so thank you very much. Anyway, but I'd never heard that 20 years later. And so, I thought that was pretty neat, but, my dad didn't brag about it. He never did. So the point is, on this handling promotions, handling influence, is God put us in these positions of influence, in these positions of promotion. And so it's not a place for us to be proudful or brag about it, but rather to feel responsibility to carry out the life of Christ in us so that we can influence the people around us. Okay, number 2, handling privilege. 5:14b. Neither I nor my brothers ate the food allowance of the governor. So remember, Nehemiah had been the cupbearer for the king of Persia. And so remember back when we studied Esther, and she was the queen of the king of Persia, and we studied the historical background of how the king of Persia would actually feed about 1,500 people a day, and that's how he kept touch with what was going on in the kingdom, because he had leaders come in, and he had massive banquets every day. So, there was no email, no phones, stuff like that. So that's how you kept in touch with people, was in person. And so Nehemiah learned that as a governor, that's what he needed to do to keep in touch with the people of the area that he was governing. And so he was governor for 12 years, as we just read. And so basically the Persian king, when he made him governor, gave him a food allowance so he could do the same thing, have a banquet every day and bring in the various leaders from the parts of the area he was governing so he could keep in touch with them. And so he says, I nor my brothers ate the food allowance of the governor. So basically what he's telling us is, he said, my position of influence came with some privileges, but I was careful not to abuse those privileges. So that's the point here, is that he said, I didn't use all the expense account that was given to me. I didn't want to abuse that. Every year, in order for me to keep I have to take medical board certification tests every 10 years. To qualify for those tests, I have to take 50 hours of continuing education that's accredited every year. And before COVID, that was always traveling somewhere. And so I'm given an allowance every year to cover the expense of that education so that I can qualify to take my test every 10 years. Well, a lot of times those courses that we have to take are in big cities and fancy hotels, and sometimes it's just ridiculous how much those things cost. And even though it's not my money to spend, I just think this is ridiculous. I'm just sleeping and taking a shower in this room, and so I'll find a much, much cheaper hotel not far away and just taxi into the meeting every morning. because, I'm not going to abuse the privileges just because I can. And so that's what Nehemiah is saying, is I'm not going to abuse the privilege just because I can. There's in a lot of things that we do, there are privileges that we have, such as, maybe you have a company vehicle. You don't need to abuse the privilege of that. A company phone, an expense account. How about computer access? Here's a great story. I have a daughter named Jeannie and her husband JT in Lubbock. And JT works for a big civil engineering firm. And about 5 years ago, they had 375 employees. And they were going through kind of a down period. So the owners of the company determined that they needed to have a layoff. So this is how they determined who would be laid off. They got the IT department to review the computer use of everybody in the company. And no matter what level you are in the company, they wanted the 10% layoff, so 37 people. They had the IT department compile who spent the most personal time on their computer during the workday. And they got the 37 people that were abusing their computer privilege the most and laid those off. Amazing, huh? And what was amazing, JT said, was the next year, and he wasn't laid off, he said the next year, the 90% that were left had a lot more productivity than the 100% the year before, because that 90% got the message. Do not abuse your privileges that we're giving you. And you see, any of us, anybody that has a job probably has a computer. And so we are given that as an opportunity to work, not as an opportunity to goof off. So Nehemiah is teaching us here, handle your privileges properly, even if God's the only one watching. That's part of being an influencer. Number 3, handling policies. Verse 15. The former governors who were before me laid heavy burdens on the people and took from them their daily ration 40 shekels of silver. Even their servants lorded it over the people, but I did not do so because of the fear of God. So anytime you're in a position of influence, you'll probably be faced with some policy issues. And so the people that you're influencing are wanting to know, well, are the policies changing? Are things going to change around here? Are you going to keep it the same way it's always been? But the problem is the policies that are hardest to change that Nehemiah is facing here, the policies that are hardest to change are the ones that benefit you. So Nehemiah, he says he's walking into a situation where the people before him were abusing and making policies that they shouldn't have made and making it hard on the people. Now, these are not the enemies. These are the Jewish people that were in charge before he got there. So this was his own people that were abusing the privileges and making policies that benefited them. But he says, I will not do that. I will not do that. And that's an example to us that when we're in a position of influence, just refuse to stick with policies that influence us, even if they're already in force. Just say, no, I'm not going to put up with that. I'm not going to put up with that. That's not who I am. So, here's a question for you. Hopefully you are giving to our local church here, but if you give to any other ministry, a lot of people do, radio ministries, TV ministries, here's a question for you. How do you know what that money's going for? How do you know? Have a sister, another story, got a lot of stories tonight. When I was in high school there in Grand Prairie, my sister Emily, she's older than I, got a job with a TV radio evangelist in Arlington, right? Grand Prairie and Arlington are right next door, so she just drove a few miles to work. And so this was a summer job she had in high school between junior and senior high school year. And so her job was in the mail room. And of course this TV and radio evangelist was always appealing for donations, and basically he would appeal for donations in the way of prayers. In other words, if you need a prayer for healing or a prayer for this or prayer for that, send us your prayer request, but you really need your help with our ministry also. So, stick some money in the envelope too. And back then, $5 or $10 was a lot of money. And so Emily told me that in the mailroom, each person that worked in the mailroom, there were several, basically had two 55-gallon drums. And you got this big stack of mail, hundreds and hundreds of letters every day, stuff full of money and prayer requests. And so what you did was, your job, and of course they had a watcher to watch you, but you opened each envelope, you put the money in the barrel, and then you put the prayer request in this barrel. And you did that all day long till the money barrel was full and the prayer request barrel was full. At the end of the day, the TV preacher would come in. He was not praying over each individual prayer request. He would just put his hands on the barrel and pray a short prayer over the barrel. And they would make sure all the money made it to his office. And, of course, he drove the biggest, newest black Cadillac that he could drive and wore Armani suits. That's where she learned about Armani suits. Anyway, so that's what you call not handling the policies of your influence well. So, where do you give your money? There's an excellent website. I put it on your lesson sheet, ministrywatch.org. If you are giving money to any ministry outside of Ray Hope, now if you're giving money to Ray Hope and you want to know where the money goes, every month in the bulletin from the pulpit they announce a business meeting. It is an open business meeting to all members. There's nothing to hide in this church. And so if you want to know where the money goes, you go to the business meeting. We're not trying to hide anything. But if you're giving to a ministry and you don't know what they're doing with that money, whether they're buying cars and airplanes and having great vacations or building big houses or helping the poor, you go to ministrywatch.org. What this is, it is a ministry that basically they send out to every known Christian ministry every year just basically a form asking them to voluntarily fill it out, where they put in how much money they collected, what percentage goes to administration, what percentage goes to travel, what percentage goes to this, to that, and of course to the ministry itself, to the actual work of the ministry, of what they're saying that they're doing on the TV or the radio. So you can see where your money's going and see if they're really doing it. And so there are hundreds of Christian ministries that respond every year, and they are listed there, and you can see all the information. What's sad is that most of the big-name Christian ministries do not respond. What does that tell you? If they had nothing to hide, they would respond. So be careful where you send your money, because not everybody that proposes themselves as a Christian ministry is handling their policies like Nehemiah did. So integrity. We've got to have integrity when making policies from our position of influence. Okay, number 4, handling projects. Handling projects, verse 16. I also persevered in the work on this wall, and we acquired no land, and all my servants were gathered there for the work. And so, no matter what your position of influence, there's always projects to be done. There's always things to be done. In Nehemiah's case, it was rebuilding this wall. So he came there as a builder of a wall, but the Persian governor also sent word that he wanted him to be the governor. So now he's the governor, but he says, I kept working on the wall even though I'm still the governor. So the governor is down there with everybody else working on the wall. And you think, well, that's no big deal. He didn't have anything else to do. Well, not really. Look at verse 17 and 18. Moreover, there were at my table, in other words, every day at dinner, there were 150 men, Jews and officials, besides those who came to us from the nations that were around us. Now what was prepared was at my expense, for each day was 1 ox and 6 choice sheep and birds, and every 10 days all kinds of wine in abundance. So he was carrying on this, what he learned from the Persian king about having the leaders of the area come in so that he could keep in touch with them. So he would stop in the middle of the day or the middle of the evening from working on the wall and then have this dinner. But then other times he would be out there working on the wall with the people. So the lesson here is that when you're in a position of influence, you're not the Lord of the project, you're part of the project. So Nehemiah didn't put himself up and say, I'm the governor now, I'm going to quit working on the wall. No, he was down there with them. And so when we're in a position of influence, there's a job to be done. We need to be right there working with everybody else. Number 5, handling people. Hardest one for last. John D. Rockefeller, you've probably heard of him. He was a great industrialist in America. He lived 1839 to 1937, 98 years. He actually, you've heard of Bill Gates and Warren Buffett as being very wealthy people. The Amazon guy, forget his name. But actually, John D. Rockefeller, in terms of inflation-adjusted money, was the wealthiest American of all time. At one point, he controlled 90% of all the oil in America. I mean, this guy was incredibly wealthy. So he obviously had to have tremendous organizational skill. And so what he said was this, there on your lesson sheet: I will pay more for the ability to deal with people than any other ability under the sun. So let's look at 2 examples from Nehemiah here in chapter 5. 18b, yet for all this I did not demand the food allowance of the governor, because the service was too heavy on the people. So here Nehemiah's entertaining 150 people at a banquet daily, but he didn't demand of the people taxes to pay for this. He paid for it himself. And so he didn't want to run roughshod over the people just to do his own pet projects. And so he has compassion, he has sensitivity, and so that's one way we should handle the people that are under our influence, is always with compassion and sensitivity to their needs. And so he says, I didn't want to expect more of them than what is reasonable or fair. And then a second example is actually from earlier in the chapter. Let me kind of give you, we're not going to read all the verses, but what happens when chapter 5 starts, they're in the middle of building this wall and a famine hits. And so because there's a famine, it's an agricultural society, and so if you're a farmer and a drought hits, you can't grow any crops to sell or to eat. And so what's happened is a lot of the Jews are having to mortgage their field in order to eat. And then even past that, it got to the point where some of them got so far in debt they were selling themselves as slaves to other Jews. Well, Nehemiah knew that that was a direct violation of the Leviticus law, that a Jew cannot enslave another Jew. So they are already disobeying the law of God. So when he hears about this is what he says, verse 6 and 7. I was very angry when I heard their outcry in these words. I took counsel with myself. I brought charges against the nobles and the officials. I said to them, you are exacting interest, each from his brother. And so what we're talking about here in handling people, anytime you're in a position of influence, there will be times when you have to have, not maybe, but have to have what we call hard conversations, difficult conversations, conversations that are not easy, but there's serious matters to discuss, and it's time to sit down and in a kind, loving way talk about a serious matter. That's just natural when you're an influencer of people. And so Nehemiah is saying that he did that. He saw that these leaders of the Jews were not doing what was right. They were disobeying the law of God, doing something God had expressly said not to do. So he's going to bring them in and talk to them, and it's not going to be a pleasant talk. So first of all, when you're an influencer, your purpose is not to be everybody's buddy. I tell that to parents in the clinic all the time. I'll walk in the exam room, and there's a young mom on her telephone, and Dennis the Menace here is tearing up the exam room. And, she's trying to be his friend. She's not trying to be the parent. It's not the job of parents to be their kid's best friend. It's the job of parents to be parents. That means you have to have hard conversations sometimes. Sometimes you have to go farther than that. But it's not just kids. Sometimes adults don't do what adults are supposed to do. You think, anybody has a right mind and a sensitive attitude could know what the right thing to do is, but sometimes people just don't. Years ago, for several years, I was the chief of staff at the hospital here, And basically that amounted to being the policeman or the medical staff. And so complaints of how doctors treated nurses or how doctors treated patients, complication rates of surgery, just anything that wasn't going right in the medical staff. I had a kind of a executive team of doctors that I was head of, and they would address these issues. And of course, whoever we were addressing with they got to say their side. There's two sides to every story. And most of those went very well. Most of them it was, okay, I see what I did wrong. I see what I need to do better. I will do better. Most of the time it went just like that. But I was always amazed that there were a handful that just thought they were too good. And there are people like that they just think that nobody can tell them what to do. They know what's best. They know how to live their life, and nobody's going to tell them what to do. And we had a few folks like that, and they kind of had to hit the road. So that's just the way it is. So, but what I like about what Nehemiah said here is he said, I was very angry. So in other words, when he heard about this, he was very angry. So what does he do? Does he go talk to these folks first? No. What does it say he does first? He says, I took counsel with myself. So that means he kind of stepped back. He realized that he was not to approach the situation in anger. That's not the wise way to ever do this. When you have a difficult conversation with someone, you need to be calm. You need to be in control. And so you step back, you take counsel with yourself. So you pray, you think about it, you meditate, sleep on it, and then when you approach it, it'll turn out much better because your emotion is not all tied up into it. You're just talking about facts. And so in your position of influence, you have to have a tough conversation, but it needs to be in love. Okay, that's what we've learned in chapter 5 tonight. So Nehemiah has taught us how to handle promotion, privileges, policies, projects, and people in a way. The whole idea is if you handle these things, you maintain your influence. The worst thing you can do as a Christian is to lose your influence. Like we were talking about last year, last lesson, if you don't have that aroma of Christ, you're not going to draw anybody to Christ through you. In the same way, if we don't handle these things in our sphere of influence properly, again, we will push people away from Christ rather than draw them to us. So another great lesson from Nehemiah. Anyway, I hope you got something out of that. Thank you for coming tonight. Let's stand and we'll have a closing prayer.